our president. Today, we are excited to give the spotlight to our president, Stephanie Zvan, to give a presentation, Communities Without Churches, What Fandom Can Teach Organized Atheism. Stephanie is an accomplished writer, speaker, educator, interviewer, and organizer. In addition to being the president of Minnesota Atheists, she is on the board of Secular Women. She helped run 3 regional conferences for Minnesota Atheists and co-founded Secular Women Work along with Monette Richards. Secular Women Work has Kickstarted and run 2 conferences to date, and she organizes workshops for Skepticon. Stephanie's also helped run online conferences for Freethought blogs and Orbit. So today she's given the presentation, Communities Without Churches, What Fandom Can Teach Organized Religion, because when people leave religion, they often leave behind a religious community. The secular movement has sometimes struggled to build new communities for them. Science fiction and fantasy fandom has been creating largely godless communities for decades. So what lessons should we take from them? Stephanie Zvan.
Hello, everybody. So some of you may know that I grew up without religion. Weirdly enough, I never missed the community of that churches often provide, in part because I was a pathologically shy small child. But later, as I grew up, I did work to create more connections, and I found a lot of those not in organized atheism, but in fandom, sci-fi and fantasy fandom. Here in the Twin Cities, I went to Minicon for several years before their great rifts, have been attending Convergence for nearly as long as it's been around. We have done a whole bunch of educating folks, working through Convergence with Freethought blogs and Skeptic and some other organizations. You can find Minnesota Atheists at Convergence this year. We will have a party room. Our party consists of science demonstrations for young ones. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get this started. Pardon me, some of the controls are covering up other controls. There we go. So the background on this is an illustration from a very early science fiction book about going to the moon, just in case you're curious what the background is as I cover it up. Before I really dig into this, whenever the subject of community comes up among atheists, there is always somebody who is very eager to tell all the atheists around them that they don't need any community. And they really want everybody to understand that, and they really want everybody to agree with them. So I think we don't necessarily always have a great conception of what a community is. But if you have a bunch of people that it's important you understand that you don't need a community, you're living in one. And honestly, it's pretty natural for most of humanity to want community. There are hermits. We tell stories about them because they're rare. Most of the communities that are smaller than, for example, our cities or our larger neighborhoods in the US are built around churches. That's one of the reasons that churches keep happening. And churches, the communities built there, offer social and economic benefits. Your church is very often the place where you can get childcare, and particularly free childcare. It's the place where they do youth activities. It's a place where somebody will raise a bunch of money or organize volunteer efforts when you're sick. Um, and of course, as atheists, we give that up. When we give that up, that often means being ejected from the church communities, being rejected by its members, sometimes being shunned, depending on how intense the denomination feels about giving access to their community. So as atheists, what we really want to do is make it easier for people to be atheists, which means we need to build welcoming communities. We need to do not necessarily a one-for-one replacement of what churches offer, but we need to have something to catch people when they leave that community. And the best way to do that is to have our own. Additionally, on top of that, providing community gives us a base of people who we can then count on, not all of them, a lot of them, for activism as we want to do things as an organization. Weirdly enough, building community is really super easy. People will build communities around anything. They will build communities around stamps. They will build communities around cars. They will build communities around superheroes. And I mean easy. They will build communities around literally Star Wars villains. The 501st Legion is a group of people who like to dress up as stormtroopers and other Imperial officers, Darth Vader in there. And then they get together and they go around and they do charity mostly. People will build community around anything. That doesn't mean that having good communities is easy. It's difficult to have a community that doesn't isolate itself, that actually welcomes new members, that continues to value its older members over time, is diverse. We should all know this by now. It's not the easiest thing in the world to create a diverse community unless you start as one. A healthy community, a community that's good for the people who are in it, and a community that's productive, that gets things done. I mean, having a base for activism is great, but actually getting folks to work at activism can be much harder. So this presentation is some of the lessons, some of the things that Fandom does really well when they're building community. They largely do this by having conventions where people dress up, sometimes as the tiniest Captain America with a very poor fitting mask. They sometimes do it online. There are communities built around fan fiction. There are communities built around television shows and book series. And you have probably seen at least some of these, even if you're not in fandom yourself. So Fandom is really good at welcoming new members. What can we learn from that? One of the things that builds community is a shared language. Fandom has jargon. It's not just something that we use as professionals. It's something that we use when we work to get along together, that if we all share the same language, we can all talk to each other much easier. The shared language is often a shorthand, so that every time we say something, we don't have to explain it all the way through, and we can have more productive conversations by starting from a shared understanding. Our shared language indicates shared memories. I don't know how many of you have seen the Star Trek Next Generation episode where folks, where there's a race that basically talks in memes. They just make references to events that happened here or there, and they convey a lot of meaning by doing that. It's weird, believe it or not, we do it. In fandom, some of those words are things like badger. I was at the American Atheist Convention last weekend. I volunteered as a badger one evening. That just meant that as people were going into a show that had separate tickets, I was checking to make sure that everybody had the appropriate information on their badge to get them into that space. We don't call it badger in atheism, but we do in fandom. Boffing. Boffing is another, if you were a live audience, I would be asking for people to guess what boffing means. I will not ask anybody to go on record as we are recording to do that. Boffing is the practice of getting together with generally foam weapons and doing mock battle. And this is something that is very popular at conventions. I don't understand it myself, but a lot of people obviously get a lot out of it. I can't tell you the number of years that I went to Convergence and saw 3 people dressed up as Jesus boffing each other. Boffing. You're not going to understand that if you're outside of fandom. We atheists also have shared language. When we talk about a sky daddy, there are people who know that we mean a generally patriarchal, single, omniscient God. When we had to worry more about teaching evolution, rather large numbers of us know what a Gish Gallop is, named after Dwayne Gish, a creationist who just spewed so much information in any period of time that he was allowed to speak or write that it would take us forever to respond to it. But we can just say to one another, Gish Gallop, and know that this means masses of misinformation that are incredibly hard to deal with. So a shared language can bring us together, but like a lot of things that create community, can also create barriers to people who are not already part of that community. And that's something you need to be aware of when you're looking for new members. So a shibboleth is a word that was very difficult for foreigners to say, which meant that it was very good for identifying people who were part of the group that spoke the language it was in. So when we have a shared language, it's really easy to spot outsiders. And it's sometimes just as easy to tell them that they're not talking the right way because they're not using the same shorthands we are. This is fairly easy to handle online, but it's a lot more difficult in person because it slows conversation down when you like pull out your phone and Google everything. So that's something to be aware of if we're meeting with new people who we want to invite into our community. And if we're looking to welcome new members, we also need to be really attentive to rabbit hole conversations. There are a number of new female and genderqueer leaders at the national level in this movement. Talking to them about sexism and some of the challenges that we have faced in the atheist movement as non-men has challenges because there is so much history there, and some of us know it in excruciating detail, and some of us still don't even know what elevator gate is. So it can be easy to get into too much detail and make your conversation exclusionary that way. The picture that you see there is frequent texting language. Obviously, WTF does not mean where's the fleece when we're using it online. But this is a meme, is your child texting about, and pick a topic, and it renders all of the not necessarily transparent texting speak into another language. So ROTFL, rolling on the floor laughing. If you're a very online person, you know that. But somebody whose context is classical Greek, okay, honestly, they're probably not going to come up with returning Odysseus trounces fleeing lechers, but they're gonna struggle to know what's going on. So that's just another caution about being too inside in our language and discussions. Another thing that builds community is laughter. In addition to it just being fun in and of itself, humor does a couple of very specific things. It trades on shared expectations by breaking those expectations often. Same with taboos. It is funny sometimes to break a taboo, particularly when it's low stakes. So jokes often assume that we are all on kind of the same page. And if we actually are, that's a bonding experience, because having a joke we all find funny says that we have a lot of these things in common. But again, humor, even as it builds community, can be exclusionary. A lot of jokes make a person or a group of people the target. They require some group to be on the outside for all of us to be on the inside. Sometimes that might be what you want. For example, if you have a group of ex-evangelicals who are getting together to support themselves in that, having jokes that are about practicing evangelicals might be really funny, might be a really good way to build community. But also it's the kind of thing you have to be careful about. You don't want your out group to be the people you're trying to bring into your in group, essentially. Another way to do this is a lot of jokes trade on stereotypes. You have to all think the same thing about a group of people in order for something to be funny. They have found that jokes that trade on stereotypes, when they have studied this, have increased support among listeners for people to take hostile action against that group. So these are the things that they've studied are things like sexist jokes and racist jokes, jokes that trade on stereotypes about a marginalized group. Increased support for people to take action against that group. Obviously, if you want to be welcoming to that group, that is not something you want to do. And you may think that's fine, you know who your group is, but you have to remember that not everything about your audience is visible. These are people you're trying to get to know. You don't know them. So you have to be careful about the kinds of humor that you use to build community, because you don't know who you're talking to. Building a space that is designed for us as a group is a great way to build community. I mentioned that Fandom often does this by having conventions. Things that they do at those conventions are have cosplay, which is dressing up in costumes, sometimes of characters in our media, sometimes of characters that don't actually exist someplace, sometimes blending characters, lots of creative things people can do with cosplay, some of which is super elaborate. And so these conventions are a space where a bunch of people appreciate all the work that some people put into their cosplay. The reasons that we do this, both as fans and as atheists, are often because the outside world isn't giving us what we want. For example, there's a fairly high proportion of folks with autistic people in both fandom and in atheism. In atheism, because we tend to be fairly literal. in our interpretations of things, in fandom, just because autistic people tend to geek about lots of things. Fandom is one of them. But the world doesn't do that. The world is not a place that is meant to be taken completely literally. It is not a place where having special interests outside of the one you get paid for is particularly welcoming. So we're building spaces with conventions in particular, and to a certain extent with atheist groups that do meet those needs. These are also spaces where we get to talk about what we want to talk about. People will not stop us and tell us in atheism, for example, that they won't do it very often, won't tell us that we can't insult religion, or that we need to be more respectful of priests and rabbis and other religious figures that have authority. That's good, because we can't have the discussions that we want to have in spaces where that's happening. So we create our own, we build that community where we can have those discussions. This also means spaces where discrimination is reduced. I don't think I need to explain this to a group of atheists. It's less true in fandom than it used to be, that fans are discriminated against. They've done a really good job of taking over the world. Now everything is science fiction and fantasy, and your biggest movies are superheroes. But there was a time when it was very fashionable to look down on people who liked science fiction. So part of creating fandom was to create a place where that didn't happen. And then if we're doing something weird, it's just really, really nice to be surrounded by people who appreciate our work, like the people who appreciate our cosplay, like the people who appreciate our arguments against theism. So building a space for us is a really good way to build a community of like-minded people. However, those spaces can become over-specialized. If we want to have diversity, we can't define our specialty too narrowly, because very narrow interests lead to very narrow demographics. We've gone to a lot of trouble to build these spaces, which means we have a lot of people who have succeeded at one thing or another. And the tendency when people bring in new ideas is to say what we're doing has always worked. Generally, when somebody brings us new ideas, it's because something isn't working for them. Sometimes it's because they haven't seen the thing that works. Some people are always very eager to get their hands on things early, but often we suggest a new way of doing something because something has changed or new people aren't finding their place. One of the ways to deal with this is to provide a whole bunch of entry points. These are all graphics, again, from Convergence. These are various things that happen at this convention. There are party rooms, which are basically tiny hotel suites that are dedicated to one theme or another, and are open for a brief period of time where people are going from party to party. Harmonic convergence is music. Cinema Rex is movies, particularly blockbuster type movies. Theater Nippon is anime. Connie's Quantum Sandbox is hands-on activities, most of them for kids, although you don't have to be a kid. They won't chase you out saying you're too old. And that's what we do with Minnesota Atheists at Convergence in our party room as well. Another thing you need to be careful about as you are welcoming new people in, there tends to be just so you know, this chart is not particularly important in and of itself. It's just evidence that this sort of thing happens. It's a flow chart where downward arrows are people who consider themselves less geeky than the people below them. The top are published science fiction fantasy authors and artists, particularly the professional ones. As you move down the chart, you may notice that a lot of these people are people doing newer things. Sometimes they're young folks, sometimes they are working online when online hasn't been something that we could do previous. Down at the very bottom, you will notice are furries. Furries are folks who identify with some kind of anthropomorphic animal, basically, furs. They're not all furry. Some of them are scaly, some of them are feathered, but the idea is these people are identifying, and sometimes very intensely, sometimes just as a fun thing, with an animal creature. And people like to laugh at furries a lot, but the thing to know about furries is that furry fandom came out of the gay bear community, which tends to be larger and hairier guys. So furrydom was initially a way for a certain group of queer atheists to build community together. But because it's newer than some things, and because it is more specialized in terms of reaching a smaller group, it is also often considered a much less desirable thing to be, which is weird because the furries are the folks in all of fandom who have done the best job of chasing out, well, Nazis and fascists, really, who have tried to join their group. They have worked really hard to continue to be open to a marginalized group of people by dealing with the threats to that. And they have done a much better job than most of us, but they're still considered low. So think about what you're doing if you create hierarchies. In atheism, for example, we had people who write books at the top. For some reason, even though folks who don't necessarily write books may have been doing organized atheism longer, or even sometimes reach more people. And so anyway, if you're interested in hierarchies among atheists, I have a lot to say to that, but it's like an entirely different presentation. So you've brought in new members. What do you do to keep your folks who have been around a lot? As this picture makes aware, one of the first things you need to consider is disability. As people age, disability happens. Keeping your events accessible to disabled folks will help you keep your older members. But there's more than that. I mean, older members is a very relative term. For example, we have had the Secular Student Alliance, and before that, the Center for Inquiry had a campus outreach program. But the question has always been, we have all of these young people who are non-believers, many of whom are atheists, who get very involved in movement atheism as students, and then they graduate and we don't see them again. So what are we doing as a movement to find those people where they are after they graduate, to reach out to them, to make events that they want to participate in? I will say Minnesota Atheists has somehow been better at this than others. We have at least 2 former student leaders on our board, which is very unusual for a local group. It's more of a problem elsewhere. I'm not sure that's necessarily because we've done anything as a group that has been really good for that. It might just be the quality of our local student leaders, but I'm biased. So what are students doing when they leave school? By and large, they are socializing with a broader group of other young people. If you're not doing things that young people like when they have moved off of campus and can live anywhere they want to and hang out with anyone they want to, you're probably not going to see students. Students, both students now and students even from like 10 years ago, are really interested in activism. They really understand that we have a broken world that we need to fix and a limited amount of time before we can do that without disasters. And if we're not offering them opportunities to do that with us, they're going to find them someplace else. Groups that are all about the fundraising to pay a staff to get something done are much less likely to bring in students, and recently former students, because young folks, particularly these days, tend to have more time and creativity than they have money to give. They're paying off student loans, they're starting families, they are, when they are lucky enough, considering buying houses, they're relocating for jobs. Being young is very expensive. The other thing we need to consider about students is we have a tendency in this movement to consider that online interaction is somehow not real interaction with other people. Students don't think that way. Folks have grown up online. They understand that online life is real life. So many people I know who have friends who they've never met in other parts of the country or other countries because they have developed a broad online community they can't replicate necessarily with their local groups. So if we take online interaction seriously, we are much more likely to be where their students want to be. When people start a family, everything about their lives changes, and not just for that first year where they are completely sleep deprived. They have a completely different set of responsibilities, different schedules. Kids have to go to bed on time. Those kids can't put themselves to bed, so somebody has to be there. Families where there are kids still tend to have very uneven responsibilities by gender. So if we want to have women in, we need to consider that that is something that is going to be a much bigger barrier for women joining our groups at a younger age. And if we want kids to be part of, if we want kids to grow up within organized atheism, which I generally think is a great idea. The kids of folks, activists who have been in the movement for a while are really pretty impressive people. We need to offer things beyond babysitting. So we need to really think about how we keep people in our movement as they have children. And here's where I think we really start to get into talking about keeping people as they get older. There are a lot of atheist events at, for example, conventions, sometimes at student groups, that kind of thing, where it's basically, hey, let's get a bunch of people together and party. That might be actually throw a party, that might be let's go all out to a bar and drink and get silly. There comes an age. That's tiring. And there definitely comes an age where that's just too loud. So we want to think about what we offer people who are more settled. Sure, we still want to offer socializing, but let's find ways to make it maybe a little quieter. This is actually, I think, something where atheist groups have done a mostly decent job. We're not as party focused as Fandom is. So we have more opportunities for quieter socializing, and particularly since we've added a bunch of volunteering events. But we should remember that things like debates are not quiet, even if they're social. So if we're looking to bring in people who are a little quieter, we need to move beyond debates. People, as they get older, often are looking for more meaningful work. Oh, look, I have just turned an age that has a 0 at the end of it. How am I wasting my life? What can I do so I'm not wasting my life? Again, volunteering is good. Advocacy is good. And then we need to make a certain amount of space for metageekery. I know a lot of us have been atheists for quite a while. Some of us have frankly gotten bored with talking about why gods don't exist, or why religious authority is invalid, and being able to talk about how we make the world a better place for atheists is a conversation that we should have ongoing and ready for people to graduate to. Some people will want to talk about that all their lives. They will want to debate. But there are a lot of people who move beyond that initial, let's take care of these folks who have been traumatized by religion, and let's remind people that, yes, you're right, there is no God. Those are important things, but we need to consider what comes after that. Another transition that happens through life is breakups, and this happens with atheist groups too. Not that we ever argue with each other or get mad at each other or anything like, okay, all communities have strife. Every single one. We're not identical to each other. I'll repeat this later many times. We come from different backgrounds. We have different priorities. We have things that we do and don't like in people. We have directions that we want to take that not necessarily everybody wants to take. There are going to be times when another group, or when a group who is part of your group, says, I just need to go off over here and do my own thing and make a space for people who want to do this thing. And that's fine. There are probably going to be hurt feelings because we're not great at getting to that point, and we're not great at giving people permission to go off and do their own thing when they feel they need to, in part because we're trying to grow our organizations. But really, it's okay. So if we give that kind of permission ahead of time, honestly, we'll have better breakups. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but frankly, the idea that every relationship should last forever is a religious idea. For the most part, ideas of forever are religious ideas. So that's one of the things that we need to identify among ourselves and think about. We are prone, as people who have been dismissed and put upon, to the geek social fallacies. I'll talk about them in detail shortly. There are going to be leadership splits. Sometimes it's simply because we don't give our leaders a lot of support. But again, people just have different priorities. They're going to happen. And then another transition that we should really think about is our older members. Sometimes folks are need to retire from active volunteering. Sometimes folks need to retire from active attendance. We need to find ways to still hang on to those people and not forget they exist because they haven't come to a meetup in a few months. As a society, we really undervalue age. Our older folks in this movement, we're a 31-year-old organization. We have people who have been around since the beginning. They bring a lot of history. They bring a lot of experience, and we need to make sure we value that. We may disagree with them on how we do some things now, but it's never a mistake to understand why things happen the way they happen. Also, as we are a marginalized group as atheists, we need to document ourselves and our elders so that we don't have to reinvent atheism the next time a big traumatic thing happens that calls religion into question. Atheists existed long before, for example, New Atheism. That's why it's called New Atheism. But when people were discovering atheism under the New Atheists, there wasn't necessarily a lot for them to find. And frankly, older styles of atheism are going to be much more attractive to certain people. So we need to make sure we don't forget folks who've started organizations, who have worked in, for example, all the humanists who worked in the civil rights movement. We need to keep track of our own history because as marginalized people, nobody else is going to do it. All right. We also need to actively enable diversity within our groups. There are atheists of every gender. There are atheists of every ethnic and racial group. There are atheists at every economic strata that we have. There are relatively simple things we can do, not necessarily easy, but simple things we can do to make a much better movement for those folks so that they're not left hanging when they decide they're not religious. First thing is counterintuitive, but stop asking the question, where are all the women atheists? Where are all the Black atheists? Where are the Hispanic atheists? Diversity isn't always easy for you to see when you're embedded within particularly a local group, but it's there. I can't tell you, for example, how many times Greta Christina has had to answer the question, where are all the women atheists? With, hi, we're right here. See us? Yep, we're still here. It's often meant to be a supportive question, but it really isn't. It just says, you're not looking at us. And some of that is because minority groups work really hard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that work is going to be recognized. So instead of asking the question, where are these people? Find out what they're doing and make that visible to more people. Also, the people who can tell you the most about how to make your group most welcoming to minorities are those minorities. If you ask why they're not there, you're going to alienate the people who can help you do better. You don't want to do that. The other thing that we struggle with as a movement is giving people something to do. we're decent at tokenizing, saying, look, we have a Black member, we have found a Black atheist. Behold, we have a Black atheist. Which is great, but nobody wants to sit there and be stared at. The best way to deal with that is to actually get people involved. And really a lot of it is about role models. You'll see the person in this picture, actually both of the folks in this picture, are Black women dressed up as Black female characters. If they see somebody who looks like them, they are much more likely to understand. And they see somebody who looks like them doing something, not just sitting there as a trophy. They're much more likely to understand how they fit into your group. So yeah, this isn't about collecting. It's about highlighting people like you, like them, if you are not part of the minority. When folks have something to do, they understand why they're there. That gives them a reason to stay. It also helps other people in your group understand that, for example, your Black atheist is not a curiosity, but is a part of your group, is a volunteer, is somebody who runs something, is somebody who talks. They understand the importance of these people if folks have a role. Be aware that minorities find comfort in numbers. This is not unusual. It is not only something that happens to minorities. I promise you that a lot of the reason that white men find atheism to be welcoming is because there are a lot of white men in atheism. They see these are people who are like me in a way that society deems important. And these people are welcome. You can tell they're welcome because there are a lot of them. Minorities also understand that when they see a group with a lot of people who look like them, that this is probably a group where there is less of a social risk to them. They are less likely to be treated badly or treated strangely even. Obviously also less of a physical risk, because frankly, for a lot of minorities in America, there's serious physical risk right now. And it has gotten worse in the last 5 or 6 years. Gotten worse since the last time I gave this presentation someplace. Also, remember how I talked about building community earlier, sharing a language, sharing experiences. That shared frame of reference applies to minorities within your minority as well. Marginalized people don't tend to make as much money. That means that for marginalized folks, money is much more of a barrier to participation in your activities. And this is particularly true for when you are working to make your space welcoming to minorities. If folks don't already know that they're going to be welcome there, they're less willing to spend some of their smaller amount of money to take part in your events. There are ways to combat this. You can design events around marginalized groups. And some people get very heated up about this, but at Minnesota Atheists, we have a free-thinking females get-together. It is something specifically for women. They know it. They show up. They often move on to other things within our group because they see that we have gone to the trouble of doing something that is specifically for them. Again, because money is an issue, consider subsidizing diversity. The two icons you see on this particular slide, the top one is for Con or Bust, which is a group that works to get fans of color to conventions by offering donated tickets, a certain amount of donated money for travel costs. Geek Girl Con has always had, which is in Seattle in October, I think, is something that has always had a certain number of spots for marginalized creative people, whether that's or scientists, because they do a lot with science stuff there, specifically a fantasy and science fiction convention. But like a lot of us figure, if we've got geeks, it's a really good time to teach them something. If you are uncomfortable with that, either because you don't have the folks in your planning to feel that you can do the communication around this in a reasonable way, or because you have a very vocal minority within your group who will make trouble for you, at the very least, consider having subsidies available, just generally. It's something we did for secular women work. We made sure we had a certain number of tickets that were available to people who just couldn't afford to pay for it. And that brought in a higher population of particularly racial minorities than we have had for most of the big events that we've had here in Minnesota. So that works as well. Let's talk about enabling the health of your community. This is obviously a plague doctor mask. I put this in many years before the plague. So we are talking about physical health as well, although that wasn't necessarily what I meant when I chose this particular graphic for this presentation, but it is something to consider. So I have mentioned that atheists come from all sorts of backgrounds. A lot of those, particularly fundamentalist backgrounds and some cult backgrounds, are very infantilizing for the people in it. You can't necessarily expect that somebody who comes to you fresh from religion has all of the same expectations about how your group should get together, how your group should interact, all of that. But we don't want to exclude those people just because, frankly, they were abused. So there are times when we need to spell a certain number of things out. The picture that you see there is a 621 banner, sometimes seen as a 521 banner, but I think the 621 is healthier. This is something that you see literally advertised at science fiction and fantasy conventions. Our expectation for people who come to this is that every participant will get at least 5 hours of sleep a night, will get at least 2 solid meals, and will take 1 shower a day. Frankly, the need for community is so great for some folks that they would wake up, they would drive halfway across the country to come to a conference. They wouldn't buy a hotel room because they couldn't afford it. But they needed to be with people, and you would get folks sleeping in the lobby or passing out or getting a little strange in their attempts not to sleep. Meals, again, you'd have people passing out. You would have low blood sugar emergencies. And 1 hot shower, that's just necessary if you're going to pack a place full of that many people. So it's, as long as we're setting standards, we're going to set that one too. That might not be the kind of thing that you need to do at an atheist convention, although I know some who have. Again, because people would do terrible things to themselves just to get into community with other atheists. So if you're planning an event, among other things, consider that you're acting a little bit in lieu of people's parents who may not have been there for them. Don't assume everybody was raised the same way you were. Let's, set standards of basic standards of how we interact with each other. It's a lot of what codes of conduct are for. That's a lot of what our discussion guidelines online are for, is just setting basic expectations for how we deal with one another, because not everybody comes from that kind of background. And one of the few things that we often see, again, between fandom and atheism, is we see people who have been really, really suppressed in one way or another. Don't just assume that people will show up and be able to think about things creatively, or take part in the creative activities you put together. Consider making those kinds of things specifically available to folks. In the Freethought blogs party room at Convergence, we literally put out crayons and coloring pictures and or outlines of various things. And frankly, not everybody who just sat down and needed to spend a little time filling something out and making it pretty was a child. So something to worth considering. You also want to think about what you're looking to advocate for beyond mere survival. I mean, a lot of the things we were talking about in the previous slide are really things that are basic to human flourishing. But we think beyond that. So for example, encouraging good mental health habits. If there are things that a large number of your attendees stress about, things like being able to have a conversation with somebody who's not from their background, again, because they came from very sheltered places. Find ways to help them have decent conversations. You don't have to have a terrible icebreaker to have icebreakers. Give people resources for various things that atheists need. So maybe somebody has religious trauma. You can refer them to Recovering from Religion, which has their secular therapist project and has support groups specifically for that. If you have a bunch of ex-Mormons or ex-Muslims or some other group that is not well represented in the kinds of conversations that your group tends to have, tell people where to find those things that are a little more specialized to them. Grief beyond belief, parenting beyond belief. We have a lot of specialized groups on the national level that handle the kinds of things that as atheists might sometimes cause existential angst, or just be things that we don't have good patterns outside of religion for dealing with. There are groups that deal with that. Get that information out to people, make sure they know where to find the people who can help with those kinds of questions. It doesn't necessarily have to be your group. You don't have to do everything. We certainly don't at Minnesota Atheists, but we do try to make sure that people can find the things we don't offer. Okay, the geek social fallacies. These were identified in 2003 online by somebody with a Gaelic name I will not try to pronounce because I am terrible at pronouncing Gaelic. But these are things that we tend to think are important as people who have been ostracized one way or another, that don't necessarily apply when we're talking about groups. For example, somebody who was a former Jehovah's Witness who has been shunned is very likely to think that people who kick people out of a group are doing something really bad. But frankly, if you want to have a group that functions well, you have to be prepared to deal with people who don't want it to function well. Say you have a Christian who comes to your meeting and tries to proselytize in the middle of your support group, you're going to kick them out. There are other things that may happen. You need to kick sexual harassers out sometimes. You need to kick people who are racist out sometimes if you want to have anybody other than white atheists in your group. Not all of the reasons for ostracizing people are evil. Ostracizing people because they don't believe in your religion is a problem because your religion isn't real. Second geek social fallacy, friends accept me as I am. We often consider even constructive criticism to be personal attacks. And this is particularly true for people who've been told for much of their life that they need to change. But a lot of that criticism is friendly or constructive. And we need to remember that. Friendship before all. If you haven't had friends for a bunch of your life, or you have lost your community of friends, friendship can get to be really, really, really important to you. Friendship is not necessarily more important than treating everybody well. You might be friends with an asshole or an abuser. You might be friends with somebody who treats you really well, but doesn't treat other people really well. And putting that friendship in front of basic humanist principles really can be a problem. Friendship is transitive. There are very few atheists. I am friends with many atheists. Therefore, my atheist friends must be friends with all of my other atheist friends because atheists are friends. It's not how it works. And frankly, we all get along much, much better together in this very small community if we have some space. Don't have to hang out with everybody. You'll be happier if you don't try to have in-depth social conversations with absolutely everybody in your movement. You will in fact have much friendlier acquaintances if you don't try to turn every friendly acquaintance into some kind of deep friendship. Friends do everything together. If we are friends and I like this thing, you must also like to do this thing. And that's just not true. Part of the reason this is a problem within organized atheism is because we are at very different points in our atheist journey. Some of us, as I mentioned earlier, I'm frankly not that interested in debate about atheist topics. But you know what? If you are, that's actually pretty cool. I just don't want to do it. Not interested. I will happily make the argument to somebody else who says all debate is useless about why it's not. But I don't want to do it. I just don't. I don't. Don't ask me to. We'll be much better friends if you don't. I mentioned assholes. There is a lovely book called The No Asshole Rule. It is actually made or written for corporate cultures. But honestly, for any time we try to have a productive community, understanding, well, one, what an asshole is and isn't, and the cost of keeping assholes around is really important. An asshole is not necessarily somebody who just breaks society's rules. If that were true, all atheists actually would be assholes. And I like a lot of you, you're not assholes. So Robert Sutton, who wrote the book, proposed a couple of tests. After talking to the alleged asshole, does the target feel oppressed, humiliated, de-energized, or belittled by the person? In particular, does the target feel worse about him or herself? So this is not about disagreeing. This is about, frankly, making things personal. And particularly in very diminishing ways. Test 2, and this one I think for organizers is more important. Does the alleged asshole aim his or her venom at people who are less rather than those people who are more powerful? In other words, are people using the breaking of social convention to collect power at other people's expense? It's really important to pay attention when this is happening, even if you don't get complaints. And this is extra true as atheism grows, because you won't necessarily get people complaining that so-and-so is an asshole or so-and-so made my experience miserable when they have other places to go. They'll just leave. You will never know. You will never feel or directly see the effects of keeping an asshole around, but you'll feel it. And I will also be clear, it would be much more clear if you read the book, but be clear that this is habitual behavior. Everybody has bad days. This is about people who this is their common mode of operating. If we want to have healthy communities, we have to stop abuse. I just gave an entire workshop at the American Atheists Convention about this, but the short form is, in order to stop abuse, understand what it is that your group is doing. Have a mission statement, have a vision, have goals, and keep your eye on those. Because weirdly enough, abuse does not help your community. It does not help you meet your goals. So keeping your eye on your goals is a very good way to understand what you need to do when abuse happens. And that vision for your community should also include how you want people to interact. We've already talked about that, but lay it out. Tell people how you want them to get along. Not necessarily in tiny detail, but the broad strokes. Have a process that is easy to find for people to report when they're abused within your community. Keep records of that, because frankly, a lot of abusers are repeat abusers. And that becomes much easier to see when you keep records about who you get complaints about. When you're talking to somebody who has done what is considered abuse under your rules for your community or your code of conduct, you're not there about telling them they're a bad person. This is about enacting your vision for your community. So set expectations with them for change. I need you to do this differently. And tell them what will happen if they don't do that. If you do not do this, you will no longer be allowed at our events. You will be kicked out of our Facebook group, those kinds of things. This is actually the hardest of the steps on here to follow, because it requires repeating yourself a lot, because most people confronted like this will spend most of their time telling you they're not a bad human being, and that's not what it's about. Even if you go in just saying, I need your behavior to change this way, they will tell you that they're a lovely person, and that's fine, but you still need them not to do this thing. And if they do this thing again, these are the consequences. If you have people who are repeat assholes, just get rid of them. They can sometimes be managed within a community, but it takes so much work, and you have other things to do. You have things to do for the rest of your community that are not being assholes. And frankly, if you keep people around, you might be managing the situation, but there will be some things that happen that you can't see. So it's going to happen again. And our final topic of the hard stuff here. Once you have a community, how do you make it work? And by work, I mean get things done that are not just making community. You will find, particularly because you are bringing a very diverse group of people together, that you have a lot of creativity and knowledge about how to do just a weird variety of things within your community. Build space where that can get exercised. One of the things we do here at Minnesota Atheists, we don't do a lot of cosplay, but we do turn a lot of these folks into organizers. You want to do this particular thing. I never considered having atheists do this particular thing, but if you are up for running it and keeping within a certain set of rules, go for it. You want to have an end of the world party. You want to get atheists together to have a war on Christmas that actually means wrapping presents for kids. Okay, that's cool. I wouldn't have thought of that being a war on Christmas, but all right. And then once people generate these good ideas for you, put them on display. It was Hertzie who suggested we have an end of the world party at some point when yet another preacher was predicting the rapture on a particular date. So we did that. I believe Carolyn organized the first War on Christmas, but she certainly organizes them from here on. These are people we should be celebrating. These are people who come up with interesting ideas and make sure they happen. While you are harnessing creativity, you will find you have more creativity within your group than is actually useful to you. So put a few boundaries on there ahead of time, and that boundary might just be check back with us before going forward or spending any money or whatever. But do set a couple of boundaries, even if they're just think about our mission as you're doing this. Think about the mission. Really. Too many boundaries will stifle creativity, but a few select boundaries will actually strangely spur people to get more creative within the space you want. Give your community space to grow. I describe this as taking over the world. Not everybody does. But for example, pair up with other groups. That might be other groups of non-believers, like the Humanists of Minnesota. Part of the reason that we have done the winter solstice dinner as a group for so long is that the humanists take it every other year and we get a break. We can do things if we don't have to do them every year, but they still happen every year. This might be pairing up with Planned Parenthood or an abortion fund, that kind of thing, because reproductive rights are important to us. Add outside expertise as you need it. If you want to do something as a group that has been done before, don't start from scratch. Talk to people who have learned everything the hard way so you don't have to. And that might mean, so in my case, somebody who runs workshops. You want to add workshops? Find somebody who runs workshops for something else. Find out how they do it. Find out what they give to their folks who want to run a workshop. Find out what kind of boundaries they have. Find out what you need within a room or need to be able to offer. Doing all of these things, working with other people, extends your reach. You are no longer a tiny group of volunteers doing what you can fit into your evenings and weekends. You can do things, for example, when you pair up, when we pair up with a reproductive rights group. We may not have to do a lot in order to, for example, claim that atheists also have religious rights, when that is something that is important to a group that already has a bunch of lawyers. Writing briefs in front of various groups or in front of various courts, or putting proposals for legislation in front of legislators. We just have to say, oh, and don't forget atheists. And we can do, that message can reach a whole lot more people if we pair up with folks who are doing other kinds of work. Offer more, organize less. Again, the more you get together with other groups. By the way, in the picture, this is at Convergence. This is a Skeptic party room. Convergence was able to add a whole bunch of mini talks and mini sessions by bringing in Skeptic and then Freethought blogs, because we put programming in spaces that hadn't offered programming. We put topics on the schedule that they didn't necessarily feel comfortable opening up to anybody who wanted to volunteer for a panel. So Convergence didn't have to do any of those things. They didn't have to look for people who were experts on atheism or science or ethics. Some of the talks were on ethics. They just had to pair up with Skeptic. They just had to give Skeptic a space. And this is a space they were already giving to other groups. So by putting Skeptic in that space, they could do things they weren't already doing, and they didn't have to do anything more. Don't forget your volunteers. You have a remarkable number of people in a good group who want to give something back because it's given something to them. The trick is to not alienate. So make it easier for them to volunteer. If you have a particular activity that you want people to be able to do, build a kit for it. collect all the information on how you do this and make it available to new volunteers. If you have big things you want to get done, have somebody break it down and get volunteers to do the small parts, and have, spend your time and expertise as an organizer on coordinating all of those parts. Don't forget to tell your volunteers they're doing a great job. Particularly the ones who have done it for a very long time. You may consider them wonderful and dependable, and they don't know any of that unless you tell them. I mean, they hope, but if they don't hear it, they don't really know. Give something to your volunteers. It doesn't have to be big. I mean, nobody in the world would move if we didn't give pizza to all the folks who help us. Give food to your volunteers. If you are doing a special kind of event, make sure that they get some kind of merch, even if it's just like a sticker to commemorate their participation. The last one on this list is probably the hardest. Make sure your volunteers have some kind of ownership stake. Make sure that they are involved in the decisions that you make that affect them, that affect the work they do. It's often as easy as just talking to your longtime volunteers and saying, are there things that you need? Are there things that we should be doing differently that would make your jobs easier? It might mean putting them on the board, though. And the last one of the slides from this set, help your community and particularly your organizers avoid burnout. Burnout is something that takes a long time for people to come back to. So if you burn out a volunteer, it's potentially years, if ever, before you can get their help back. So when you have volunteers who do a lot, encourage them to take some time away. You have been helping with everything this year. I appreciate you being willing to do this, but go on vacation or something. Have a large volunteer base so that you are spreading the burden rather than calling the handful of people you know are dependable at the last minute when you need them. Working smarter. I already mentioned breaking things up into smaller tasks. But this is also a reason to find people who have done these things before. If you know how to do something and you can show your volunteers how to do it, or they know how to do it and you're willing to do it their way, you are taking away some of the work from them. You are making their lives easier by just paying attention to the people who know what they're doing. We already talked a bit about detoxifying the community, but frankly, your volunteers are some of the higher profile people within your community. They are often the people who people see when they have a complaint or have an idea. So they are the folks who often interact most with the assholes and abusers in your community. If you take care of those problems, it's less of a burden for your volunteers. And then celebrate. Celebrate. We often, and I think this is particularly true in the last few years, feel like we have so much on our plates that we just can't, that we can't stop, that we can't take a moment and rest and say, yeah, we did that. We did a great job. People had fun. We, got the information in front of the people who we wanted to. We should just rest for a moment and bask in that and be really proud of ourselves. But that's an important part of avoiding burnout, because part of what happens in burnout is you feel like there is an unending churn and you never get anything done. You celebrate the accomplishments, you mark them, and people know that their work isn't for nothing. So that's my advice on building community. I didn't draw all of it back to Fandom, so if you have any questions about that, please ask. But otherwise, get out there and keep building community. And let me know if you have any questions. Where is my cursor?
Any questions? George?
Yeah, it's been a long time since Minnesota Atheists has held a conference. Are there any plans to do so?
We were going to consider doing another secular women work in 2021. That obviously didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
We have not talked about a conference that is not that, but we've been talking to American Atheists. They want to do a national convention here sometime in the next few years. They wanted to actually for our 30-year anniversary, but it was too late when they realized it was our 30-year anniversary and they couldn't find anything reasonably priced for that time frame. But we are on their list for the next few years. We may also do another secular women work that is combined with a regional leadership conference for them. So we bring in more folks from all over the place and expose people here to new leaders who they haven't necessarily had a chance to hear from yet. But we haven't talked about doing a straight up Minnesota Atheists regional conference recently.
Okay.
Anybody else? Did you see anything on those slides that really confused you and you want answers about it? All right then. Thank you, everybody, and I hope this was useful.